The Why Didn't You Test That podcast want to improve your software. Join Hugh, Rich and their guests. They share experiences and insights on the many sides of better software delivery.
Hi everyone, we're back again with the magnificent Chris Rowett. So I think we finished. I was just re-listening to the end of the last podcast, and Rich was waxing lyrical about putting actually kind of a plan on how people can make change in complex organizations. Yeah, and I was just listening to it. It sounded very sensible, Rich. Well done. I mean, it actually gave people a bit of optimism and hope. I mean, just listen to the last 5 minutes and ignore all the rest of us three old blokes ranting. So before we sort of we were just chatting a little bit before here. So before we do that, we just did a podcast with Chris Dutter. It's amazing you've never heard of something, you suddenly hear about it 4 or 5 times in a week, which is this kind of, was it Dharma and all that, the metrics and all that kind of stuff. Being able to Dharma or Dora, that's right. Dharma, wasn't he a serial killer? Yeah, that's the one.
Yes, he was, yeah.
Well, maybe that's it. I've equated the two.
What are you watching?
They basically seem to have got 4 metrics and seem to be thinking that that's going to solve world peace and hunger. Chris has added in a few extra, but there are so many different metrics which are to do with subjective and objective, and being able to put some discipline on top of them to be able to say that these metrics do have value, and also being able to use a bit of brain power in terms of how these different metrics relate to each other, to the behavior of people within teams. Organizations like, an SI may well have a different agenda, which is to make their DORA statistics look fantastic. So I've probably said about 9 times, what's the most common reason for a bug? It's whatever's on the top of the list for reason for a bug. So on the drop down, that therein lies the kind of core problem there. So this ability to go and gather metrics. That said, the idea of value streams, another way of being able to persuade an organization that, putting some kind of other lens on what's happening within the organization is obviously a good idea, because it just tends to be thousands of sprint points and features, which, is so what. So I think that's an interesting space. Just you two could just chat about what your feelings about that kind of value stream. I mean, and to a certain extent, we at Curiosity are a little bit bogged down in the technology, but what we're actually trying to do is to improve that value stream by tackling the harder problems. Being able to get notified within 3 seconds that this particular JIRA is a problem is fairly relevant. If the JIRA is poorly communicated and doesn't link with anything else and hasn't been thought through, and there isn't really, the complexity of it isn't fully understood, etc. So, we obviously tackle modeling in spades, and that's primarily a communication tool between people to either pay off technical debt, to talk between teams, or to even just build new features or complex features. And in fact, we've gone back through some of our original users and say, well, how are you using the tool? Because originally we sort of came in as a testing tool to help them build automation scripts or to build test cases, but now they're actually using it, which is kind of what we had in the idea for the whole product, which is this idea to collaboratively model out complex problems to be able to flesh out an understanding, so that you find probably close to 60 to 70% of your bugs or your problems up front, because you've actually thought them through. And how hard is this going to be to test? How much negative testing? How much positive testing? What happens if something changes? How are we going to maintain all that? All of those types of things are what people are now starting to use Modeler for. And then obviously the other one is test data, which, as you know, is just such a big problem, and trying to get people to understand the effect of average to rubbish test data on your development process compared to even quite good test data is astronomical. So that's kind of where we've focused, but we don't really couch that in terms of a value stream. So let's start with you two, seeing if you can come up a way to. So what's your experience with sort of value streams and being able to persuade organizations to use that, and then getting them to be able to think about some of these harder problems and how tackling those would probably give you the biggest bang for the buck in an improvement of a value stream?
It's a super important area, and one that is like when we talked briefly last time about agile adoption and other things. It's still very variable on where especially large organizations are in that journey. The biggest problem I've seen over the last probably 5-10 years working across those different industries, financial services and banking and telco, media, etc., is as they go on that journey and try and become more agile, go for value stream approach, those sorts of things. It's a big change for them organizationally. It's a big change for multiple roles that they have. I do take your point on modeler, a great way to bring what was traditional kind of business analyst type, with technical folk and allow them to have all those different perspectives on the end-to-end problem. Because as you bring that out into the large, it's still fairly immature, I think. If you were to look across a whole organization and say, well, how many teams are now, feature teams, fully agile, doing a value mapping approach? Because there's so many stages still in those pipelines of compliance and checking and security and all these, and still a lot of those teams don't talk to each other. So, we came up with this concept, a decade ago, and I'm sure it's not new, of horizontal trust in teams. Within the last 9 months, I was working with a large organization who repeatedly test the same areas of the code with the same tests, because as it marches inexorably towards production, because the teams don't trust each other. Our internal teams that don't trust each other, and some of them are third parties who they brought in to do various phases of testing for them, and they have a contract that says they must do things, and so they double check everything because they don't believe the previous team will have done their job well. So you've got that level of problem to say we've got a lot of redundancy in the pipeline because we just don't speak and we don't understand what each other do, or we don't believe, or contractually we're obliged to protect ourselves, combined with what I think was still rife for those that aren't using things like Modeler, is there's still quite a gap between business-oriented business analysts and people writing tests, people executing tests, people building automation and those sorts of things. So until we can find a better way to bring people together, so there's joint end-to-end ownership of the problem with clearly defined metrics and ways that people are measured in those areas, whether that's financially or penalties or story points or escape defects or whatever that happens to be, depending on where you are in that journey. But the second piece is how are we teaching people new tricks? How are we being efficient with the resources we have in a newer, more collaborative world? And that happens level one at the practitioners. We've got various practitioners who need to learn to work together. I had a customer who we were helping them find areas they hadn't tested in their code. So that's a good thing, right? So you're about to push some code into production. We will show you that there's this key change that you've just made in the latest commit, and it's never been tested. There's no unit test, there's no functional test, there's no nothing, right? And you think that's a good thing to know that. So I now know I'm at a risk of deploying something unpleasant. But then, when they started looking at, well, who are we going to need to get round a table? Now we've seen that there's an untested piece of code to actually identify what the business logic is, what the code's trying to do, understand what the code is, which tests therefore do we need to write. And for a traditional organization, that's 3 or 4 different people from 3 or 4 different groups in different domains. So, so you can tell a tester, here's a missing untested, piece of the code, but who do they need to speak to identify and then write the missing test? So, bringing, and there are, obviously if you've got feature teams and people are working more collaboratively together, that barrier gets lower and lower, but we're still, quite a lot on that journey. So I think a value stream approach is super, but it's getting people end to end to understand the value, getting them the right education to collaborate, and the tools at that point, as you said, Hugh, do become communication, because they're hopefully sharing the right information at the right time to the right different people in the domain, so they can collaborate better and they can understand what needs to happen.
So I guess I'm going to echo a lot of what Chris said, right? This is where value stream pipelines, right? What's the time? I think I mentioned Better Value Sooner, Safer, Happier, which is a book that kind of nationwide bought into a lot of the kind of the DevOps movement and a lot of the books that came out of that, right? And one of the sayings from there was time from idea to value, right? Which is a bit like one of the DORA metrics, right? And essentially that's looking at what Chris said there around the end to end. I always imagine a pipeline, right? And today, in a lot of organizations, value streams can be articulated as a pipeline where there's a hell of a lot of clogging, right? And I think a lot of the transformation activities, if you call it that, are just looking at doing things faster. And essentially, if you've got a blocked pipeline today and you try to push more into it more faster, you're just going to get more of a spillage, right? And that's the kind of the way that I've seen a lot of value stream implementation happening. I think a lot of the interesting part around, go faster, go slower to go faster up front is to understand how to unblock all of those things. I think when we're talking about testing, I think a lot of testing effort is wasted, right? The most efficient thing you could do in test here and now is understand what you're doing, understand what's wasted, and stop doing it, right? And you do that through start understanding what the system is doing. How do you implement the blast radius or limit the blast radius? Because you're doing a hell of a lot of end-to-end stuff at the end of rubbish coming out of your pipeline, where you're trying to figure out how this thing all comes together. And that's a massive waste of time and effort and a way of working, where actually those individual pipelines and that conversation up front could have stopped all of that stuff from happening. And like Chris said, the teams are stuck in their ways of working from a long, long time ago. And, agile, DevOps, all of these things, whilst they've come in with good ideas, they've not been implemented properly. And it's too easy to fall back on what you already know. And so implementing a lot of those good practices up front, it sounds too simple, but start to implement some of those things to stop doing the wrong things later on will save you a hell of a lot of time. And, ultimately it'll make you faster in the long run.
Yeah, all sounds sensible. I mean, the thing that kind of drives me slightly bonkers is that there's so much. I mean, I keep saying there's so much cool technology around nowadays, and you just need someone with a bit of imagination to say, well, if we applied this piece of technology to what we're doing, that would save us a ton of time and give us a ton of information.
Do you think there's too much technology though? This is where I've done talks before where I say we although we're working in information technology, we've kind of lost the eye. We're just working in technology, and therefore this is where you see, how do I unclog it? I just chuck loads of technology in it for technology's sake.
I just think it can be like a teeny tiny thing, so coming back to your idea of the, Chris's thing about something being completely, they had no idea that this wasn't being tested. They didn't know what it did. I mean, we've got so much good stuff out there. I mean, the simplest thing is just snapshot it, run a simple transaction, create a diff report, and you think, oh, that's interesting. So that one does this. Fine. Okay. And then you do another one, and then you do another one, and then you do another one. None of that takes much time. And you're probably, running through maybe you say you pick your top 20 transaction types, and you say, well, okay, that now we understand what those do. Let's run them into, a little kind of BPMN engine and build out a little picture. And we've spent. I mean, I've probably said this before when we were sitting with a bank and we had 70 VPs in the room, 20 VPs in the room, all being paid an absolute fortune, flown into London, trying to work out what ShareTrade did. Meanwhile, Paul and I were in the background just snapshotting the Oracle database. Which is absolute doddle, with about 7 pieces of SQL telling them exactly what every single type of trade did, and they didn't believe us. And I mean, it's just like some kind of just use teeny tiny bits of technology, to pay off technical debt, and then you can say, well, okay, that looks cool. Why don't we just set that up kind of automatically? And now we've done it, we'll just add it into our little pipelines and our automation scripts. And at the end of the script, we're going to say, well, this is what it actually did to the database, and this is the messages that it created, and here's a little metadata using AI to abstract the information out. And so there you go. Or even if you get competing ones, you could just send it out to, just fire it off to as a Teams message or and just say, is it this or this? And you say, yes, no, don't know. All of these things can just be built into kind of this idea. When we were talking about this idea of spending about 10% of your budget on actually supporting your IT by putting in nice, simple pieces of technology, which is lots of it's out there. If you need anything, just go onto Git, you'll find it. Just have 1 or 2 guys who spend 50% of their time just building all these nice little accelerators, and then once they start getting embedded, you can say, well, let's start putting them into our DevOps frameworks. Let's have some feedback loops. Primarily, it's technical debt. It's the first one. In terms of being able to understand that, and then the second one is a spin-off of that. Is once you've done that, you've then got basically gates, which you can then introduce then. to everything. And you're basically saying, well, this transaction looks odd. We've never seen this one before. Let's just notify people. So we've got all of this sort of great stuff already in there, but we're just not having the imagination to be able to use any of it in any kind of way. And people look at me and go, that's a good idea. And then they do absolutely zip about it. Nothing, nada, can't be bothered. That was an interesting chat. Let's go and have a beer, Hugh. Fabulous. Nothing.
Yeah, so let me soften that slightly. So far be it from me here. I think the issue is that there is a ton of technology, and it's easy to come and say, you want someone's time, you want a bit of their mind share, go in, let's do something simple, right? And here's a whizzy tool that's going to give you some visibility you didn't have. You can make better decisions with it. You can, now test more effectively for less money and less time, which everyone wants. The actual challenge is, if you're speaking to someone who kind of listens and says, yeah, that's a good idea, but it goes nowhere, it's because they haven't got the power internally, or they haven't got the persuasion tools themselves to make this a priority. So, if, and I've had tons of these sorts of conversations at many levels, and quite often you'll get stuck, and it's because the people you're talking to don't perceive they have a problem. It's clear the organization has got a problem, but I'm quite happy. I run 200,000 tests. They run overnight, 8 hours. No one's yelling at me about it. Right. Whereas if you go up a layer, or you go across the business, and they're like pulling their hair out because there's too many defects, and they're really slow to market, and their reputation's bad, and all these sorts of things. So that whilst it's not fun, this is where actually getting into the organization to understand that what problem are we trying to solve here, and who's ultimately got the mandate to solve that. And that might be someone very senior in IT because they're being screamed at by the CIO or the business, or it might be someone in the business because their revenue stream is detracting because their product's a disaster compared with their competitors and so forth. So I think being able to map you have to have the air cover of someone who's going to sponsor a change, and you might start in, and we talked last session about doing this in an incremental approach, finding an initial incubator where you can get some quick wins and all that type of stuff. I mean, that's a strategy for adoption, and we can talk a little more about that in a moment, but it still needs sponsorship. Now, you might get that sponsorship by finding that first practitioner, buying them enough beer, whatever you do, and actually showing them a meaningful result so that they get excited enough to take you to their boss with the results, who then gets excited enough to take them to the director, who then gets excited enough to go, and you can walk up that path. But the solution is, finding people that have a pain that you can solve, or if their pain's not big enough to worry anyone, what is it a bigger part of? What, the fact that they don't know what those financial transactions are doing. Well, who's that hurting, or who might that hurt? So who do we need to have that conversation with? The fact you run 200,000, tests every night. I mean, the organization where that was true, they're running 8 hours of regression. We eventually got them to move because they did a big cloud program and they moved everything to the cloud. And suddenly 8 hours of intensive parallel compute in the cloud was a lot of money. Right. And the person who was originally responsible for that on their data center didn't pay the data center. And now out of their budget comes the cloud infrastructure cost. So suddenly running running the right tests, not all of them, becomes interesting. So I think it's matching that with the appropriate technology that's going to give them the insights to make a better decision and make things more efficient. Make sense?
Yeah, to me, I agree with the top-down sponsorship. I also think there is we're too individually siloed by our domains, and therefore a lot of our conversation will be around how do I test this, right? But yet, to me, and where we found advocates in architecture, through design, into build, into test, where we talked a common language around quality, right? And so I will always talk about limiting the blast radius, right? And therefore that's something in test around creating isolation. I'm talking essentially around an architecture principle around loose coupling, right? And to me, there is like a stick of rock where you've got some writing that goes right the way through the piece of the whole value stream, to which if everybody signs up to actually, yes, we must understand how loose coupling works for this, and that must trail through the whole life cycle, That whole quality conversation, the whole collaboration of working together and articulating technical debt risk or whatever it is becomes a hell of a lot of a stronger message because it's a whole team thing. I think it's too easy, not just to chuck it to another team in a different value stream, but for architecture to chuck it down to another team, or for, if something is found in integration testing, that architect to say, well, that's a testing problem or testing is too slow. No, actually, that's a collaborative thing around, okay, so if we didn't know this, why didn't our loose coupling design practices identify this early and therefore we addressed this as a team? Why didn't that conversation happen? I think there is that element as well that's very strong, that as well as the top down, yes, you have my sponsorship to do this, there's the bottom up. Actually, yes, this is really motoring because we're all bought into trying to understand the same things and facing into the same problems.
Yeah, and I think, Rich, one key thing there is that it absolutely is parallel, as you said. Without the top-down sponsorship, you can start, right? But then it's a real uphill battle to get it moved and adopted anywhere, because they have 1,000 other problems, and of which you're solving one. It's an important one, but maybe the business don't understand, maybe other people don't care, or maybe they've got bigger things on their plates, right? So the top-down sponsorship then enables you to get the money and the funding and the attention and the mind share to keep it going. The second piece of that is, when you have got some success and you've learnt an insight and you've now got something repeatable that you want other teams and other practitioners, to learn and pick up, and maybe the technology you embedded to help that is the right tool to enable that acceleration, because tools are accelerators. They either give you insights you hadn't got before, or they enable you to do things at the speed you need for business. And so if you've now incubated something, it's been a success, you've gone back to the big bosses, they're super happy with you because that's why they did the prototype, or like gave you some latitude, of a few sprints to try something out. It's not magic now that gets then driven across the organization. Now you start the long and winding road to try and get other teams to care, other teams to prioritize and understand what's in it for them. And the what's in it for me is the biggest point you have. Right? Because it's easy to say what's in it for the business, right? If we can be more competitive, if we can make 1% more profit, if we can get into this market quicker, if we can be big to our competition, if we can save money, they're easy things. But, as when I was a developer, did I care about those things for my company? At some levels, I'm sure I did. But what I cared about was I doing stuff, was I doing interesting stuff? Right? Was I solving problems? Was I being efficient? Was I, and so if you can give me things that enable me to do my work better and produce a better product output that I'm proud of, that's a win. If you can, I'm one of the big banks we worked on. We did a big prototype with our technology. It was super successful. So we were super happy. They were happy. Over the next 6 months, it went nowhere because the team whose problem we'd solved their problem. They were happy. The boss who sponsored us, okay, you did what you promised, guys. Thank you very much. But all the other teams were like, I'm too busy to talk to you, right? And so you've got the CIO coming down saying, you shall adopt this new whizzy thing that's going to help you. I remember Hugh's story from when he was a developer. I remember being a developer and, the boss coming down and say, Chris, you've got to use this new tool we've just bought for everybody. I was offended just to be told that you need a tool by someone who's not a technologist. So I came up with 50,000 really interesting technical excuses why it wasn't going to work for me in this context, but thank you for the idea, right? So the only way that works is for you to get other practitioners like me and get them to tell me, oh, by the way, we put this thing in, and last time we had a major release, we didn't get called in overnight. We got our evenings and weekends back because now we've got the insight, we're testing the right stuff, it goes in quickly, we've got time to redo if we need to. And now I'm saying to my boss, why didn't you give me that? Not the other way around. So, it's definitely finding the quick win, but then telling me the value in my role, not telling me what's good for the company. And that for me is key. And organizations where we've seen adoption flow, they've got a really good work stream in the program that's all around that. It's all around capturing the wins, capturing the value, building enablement to keep everyone going, but also showing at each level in the organization on a regular basis why it's valuable and why you should be doing it. At the top level, it's probably a quarterly business review saying, oh, is there still an ROI? Are we still going to fund this? At the practitioner level, it's is it making a difference to my daily builds? Is it making a difference to my test cycle? Are we being more effective because we've now put in this technology to, that we didn't have, with the insights we didn't have before?
So thinking back a little bit to we did some work with Rabobank, and actually they had quite an interesting. I mean, they're the guys aren't familiar. They were the farmers' bank basically in Holland, and were considered quite sort of conservative with a small c in terms of not really doing things kind of slow and steady and all that kind of stuff. But actually, when we were there, they were absolutely very much focused on change, and what they did, they kind of went around, did an audit of all the various tools, coming back to the technology stuff, and said, all right, for requirements management, we've got 7 tools, we've got this, we've taken over these 4 companies, some are using the IBM tool, some are using this, and they said, right, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to have like a Dutch auction here, people, and we're going to get it down to 2 tools. You can have 2 tools for each of the categories, which was then everyone had to kind of go up and bat for this particular tool, because obviously that meant that the people who were using the rational product then had to ditch for using that and then move into the other tools. But Dutch quite practical, and they went, yeah, kind of makes sense. We've got to do this. And if you sort of have that mindset of saying, well, okay, if we've got 2 tools, then we can build a synchronization engine between the 2. We can get both of our reporting engines can also read 2 tools for it to try and, and if we equalize the codes that are used in both of those tools, then fine, we're going to end up with much the same metrics coming out of them. So, but that came very much down from a sort of a culture within the company was saying, this is madness. We can't keep doing this. I flipped to one team and I've got to learn another set of tools. And also management realizing that was a bit dumb. Obviously, they're having to pay for the maintenance for all of these tools as well. So that seemed like a quite sort of sensible way of going about it. Now, I'm sure the trench warfare that went on between the teams trying to get it from into the last 3 and then into the last 2 was probably fairly massive. But you need to put together a pretty solid set of technologists as well to make sure the integrations then worked and you got people moved over into those new ways of working. So that was the first thing. And then the other one was standards, in terms of one of the other things they did, which I actually haven't really seen anywhere else, is they had a corporate dictionary, which is in Power Builder. But it worked, and it was the only tool they had for that, and that's why it stuck around. So they had all of the table definitions and all of on the mainframe to the SQL Server to MySQL to Postgres to whatever. They had them in one location, and you could kind of look up a table structure. And it was maintained in there, and it was kind of part of the DBA's jobs and the business analysts to kind of use and maintain that. So that was quite encouraging, but that imposed standards. Then they used Visio, and they switched then to Agile Designer at the time, which wasn't really a big jump for them because it was modeling. But again, they created what they called a guild, and that guild was basically people who are in charge of the standards, and also the people who they started off nicely by saying, hello, you're still using Visio, and then gradually it was like, your Visio license has been removed, will be removed next week. You haven't been on the training course, and they actually took some time to get people moved over onto using that. So all of that was a kind of very gentle but effective way of changing an organization. And as you're moving people across them, then you have this chance to be able to put these standards in. And I like Rich's idea of people coming into his team initially before they went out. So any new people who came in were forced into that team and to go out then into the wide world with a sort of, a little, Mao Zedong's little red book, the Moonies, whatever you want to call it, say this is the way forward, and this is the way, if teams need to communicate, this is the way that people need to be able to be able to produce the work so people would understand it commonly across the team. So you can slot people in and out of teams. Otherwise, how do you drop a good person, who's a specialist in payments but is a whizzy programmer, and just drop him on, the transfer mechanism system, because they'll be like, it's like starting a brand new job, 6 months in and you're still learning all the systems they use, which is just crazy. So, that would seem to be a set of sensible approaches.
I think just picking up on that, I pick the word force. We moved, and I think this is a trend within testing, IT development, let's face it, to more of a model of democratization, right? And therefore we had a saying within Nationwide that was talked about accountable freedom. And so I think Chris alluded to it when he talked about vertical. I can't remember the term you used, but essentially giving the individual squads or teams freedom to go off and do what they want to do. But the accountable bit came in, right? So a lot of the teams went off with the freedom bit, and then the accountable bit was a hot topic of conversation around what does it mean to have accountable freedom. And so we had guardrails, which was a bit like the kind of the governance or the standards that you pick up. And then from a tooling perspective, as an example there, we had a set of behaviors and principles rather than almost a mandate to say you need to use this tool. And I think the interesting part for us is not the stick in terms of you must use tool X, but the carrot which says, actually, we will enable you to be as efficient as you can be and see the value in using this, because anything that you might choose over and above that actually is going to be more painful for you to do that. So why not take the path of least resistance and use the capabilities that you're built up within the organization to use, right? And basically you get into a lot of cutting away I was going to swear then, but it'll get cut out. But, in terms of automation tools, for example, right? A lot of them do the same thing. A lot of them work in the same way, right? And so we came up with the principles which said, right, first and foremost, your automation tool that you use should be aligned to the development language that your team build upon, right? And therefore, if your payments platform is built on C#, then your open source framework should use C# as an underlying language to test automation. And therefore, you've got a high synergy between what the team use and what the automation is built upon, all right? As I've already alluded, you should use open source as a first principle because, to the point that Hugh made, you don't want to be spending a lot of money buying lots of licenses for lots of different things, but understanding that there is a pathway for a lot of these tools into a paid product, and therefore understand what you're doing in the first instance to bring these things in and how you're realizing the value to get to a paid product if that's the thing that we want to be doing, right? And then you get into the more technical things around, your code should sit with other underlying code in code repositories, and therefore you've got this high synergy between individual teams using certain tools, same language though. Actually what you start to find is if you get underneath the underlying languages, actually Nationwide predominantly use C#, Java, and JavaScript. All right, so we have 3 underlying languages and therefore tools to do automation. So we didn't have this proliferation of tools. Eventually, everyone consolidated down into a certain set of open source tools. All right, then you can start to build on community kind of talk around that, which is actually they're all built on the same libraries. So why not try and incentivize the reuse between certain teams that are sharing these things? So you get this high degree of collaboration. Essentially, what I'm getting at here is that actually there is a high, advantage, a high incentive for individuals to adopt or individual teams to adopt these things because they are so enabled by what's in the organization already, and they're incentivized to build upon these things rather than taking an alternate path that nobody else is doing. It becomes, back to this kind of movement, and I can't remember the juggernaut kind of, I think was the kind of the saying from last time in terms of actually once you've got this momentum, people are far more likely to follow rather than this kind of piecemeal, this team does this team does this team does this. And, that's where almost we didn't need to have that mandate to do certain things. You had, I call it soft influence, right? The royal family has got a lot of soft influence in the UK, and it's the same kind of principle in terms of we didn't actually have a real mandate, but yet everybody would follow because we made things a hell of a lot easier to do it. That was a ramble.
It was valid, yeah, and I've seen it a lot, in terms at various degrees of total freedom with accountability, as you said, through the other level where it's like dictatorship. Thou must use this because ultimately the organization wants to be further right, right? It wants to be more standards based and documented, and it wants to enforce those standards, because then it gets consistency on approach, consistency of skills and training. Yes, obviously outside the domain. So if you're a payments guy versus something else, a trade guy, there's a whole domain gap. But if you're a technologist who knows how to use this automation framework for deployment, and you join another team and they use the same one, great. You've got transferable skills in the organization, so that's helpful. A lot of organizations use the the promise of freedom to choose more as a learning vehicle. It's like a petri dish. Every team, off you go, every squad, pick what you like, right? And we'll give you an incubation phase when you can go wild, bring in your favorite open source, bring in whatever tools you need, but here, and then here's the accountability, but here are the outcomes we're expecting. Yeah. And then over time, it was like Darwinism. Some would naturally grow, and because they're getting better results, and they would tell their friends, and they would become part of that particular tribe of users of a particular a tool that's providing a particular capability for them. And then it could be around technology stacks or other areas. You get these pillars of coherent tools that those teams would then use, and then you put the infrastructure around them, to teach and incubate and learn and measure and all those types of things. Because the very large organizations don't want every team, they don't want the Wild West, right? They do want the standards and the repeatability as much for consistency, cost, and Hugh, when you talked about Rabobank, that every now and again an organization will do the IT refresh, IT cost saving. It's normally driven from cost saving. They're normally saying, we've got 1,000 tools in the shop, we need to cut it down, we're not paying all these maintenance bills. But it's much more than that. It's about fluidity of staff around the organization who have certain skill sets in certain technology stacks. So it was really interesting hearing the nationwide journey, but I see versions of that more or less controlled depending on their maturity as they try and figure out what the right approach is. Now, you do get other organizations who come in with someone super sharp at the top who just says, no, this is our playbook, you will use this. And then, then you get some unpleasant conversations, but you end up with a kind of a similar result. But again, all of this is around, why are you changing and what are you trying to get? Now, if it's just we have too many tools, it's just cost, right? That to me sounds like IT budget being cut. We need to do something to rationalize our software estate to deal with that.
I think at Rabobank it was just a lot of this is a bit mad. Yeah. People couldn't transfer around really because they were sort of having to learn different things, and it was also they couldn't report because all the reports were coming up in basically middle managers. Middle managers spent the whole time aggregating up 7 different
probably
reports
in Excel,
so exactly. Yeah. I mean, they just with a few macros to try and make it look roughly the same, which is kind of a bit mad. So. All right, lads, I think we're kind of bumping up to the end here. So this has been slightly calmer than the last one.
Well, I had a week off, so I'm
Oh, right. Okay, fine. I'm stuck in the weeds of trying to get a few bits of integration working here at the moment. Fantastic. So, Anyway, okay. Well, Chris, it's been fabulous chatting with you. Yeah. Okay. Thanks both of you, and see you all next time. All the
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Why Didn't You Test That podcast. To continue the conversation, head over to curiositysoftware.ie and don't forget to subscribe for more episodes.